Hi, my name's Matt, and I'm excited to share my top 10 sites of Washington, D.C. with you in this video. So I've been to Washington, D.C. many times, and I want to share with you the things that I enjoy the most when I go there. Now, D.C. has so many things to offer. So at the end of the video, I'll give you some of the honorable mentions, some things that are really popular with other people. But let's do a countdown here of my favorite things to do in Washington, D.C. So number 10 is to visit the Smithsonian Museums. So these are free museums that are located at the mall in the center of the city. So the mall is called the National Mall. This is actually just a big park with monuments and museums surrounding it. It's kind of the center of Washington, D.C., and it's the place that you go to visit. Smithsonian Museums are, as I mentioned, they are free, and they include the American History Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Air and Space Museum. The newest one is the African American History Museum, I believe, or the African American Museum. There's also the Native American Museum. There is the National Portrait Gallery and the Art Museum. I can't remember the official name of that one. So these are all called Smithsonian Museums, and they're all free. So check out the Smithsonian Museums when you visit Washington, D.C. Okay, number 9 is to go to a Washington Nationals baseball game. So if you're a sports fan at all, consider going to a sporting event like a baseball game or a football game. The nice thing about baseball games is they're going all summer long, and they play every night, as opposed to football where they're only playing once a week and only 8 times per year. They play 81 home games in baseball, so there's a good chance that the Nationals would be there while you're visiting. Now, I'm a sports fan and I'm a baseball fan, so I really enjoy doing this. One of the things I like about it is just that I can go sightseeing during the day, and then I can go kind of take a load off at night and just sit back and watch a game for a few hours. Number 8 is Arlington National Cemetery. Now, a lot of other people would rank this much higher on their list, but for me, this is number 8. Arlington National Cemetery is quite a sacred and hallowed place. Now, when you visit Arlington, what you can do is take the shuttle around the cemetery. Now, Arlington National Cemetery is a cemetery that was set up during the Civil War and is a place where people who are connected to the military can be buried. So I don't think you actually have to have served in the military. I think you just need to be connected in some way. So what you do is you take a little shuttle ride around the cemetery, and they'll give you a little tour and tell you about the graves, and each tour guide will tell you different stories. And then they'll drop you off at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So this is something that a lot of people really look forward to on their visit to Washington, D.C., is to see the changing of the guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And then you can go to the gravesite where JFK is buried, and his wife Jacqueline is there as well, and they have the Eternal Flame on display right there next to their graves. Also is the Arlington House, which is where Robert E. Lee lived. He was the commanding general of the Southern Armies, and it's just a big fancy mansion. It's actually really a cool place to visit, and that sits just above JFK's grave. Okay, number 7 is to visit the monuments at the mall. So I mentioned that the mall is this big open park with a bunch of monuments there, and just browse around the monuments. I'm going to actually mention a couple that are on my list a little later, but there are so many monuments all over the place, dedicated to wars, to famous Americans, to presidents, all over the place in the city. Everywhere you go, there's monuments and memorials. Number 6 is to visit the U.S. Capitol building. This is where Congress meets, and you can book a tour through your congressional representative. Have them take you around the Capitol. What they'll do is they'll take you into the old Senate room. They'll take you into the rotunda. So this is underneath the big centerpiece that you see at the top of the Capitol, the big dome. Depending on when you visit, you can actually attend a congressional session, although that sounds dreadfully boring to me. I probably wouldn't do it. But I do enjoy the tours, and I like looking at the craftsmanship in the Capitol, the artwork, and just learning about some of the stories there. To book that tour, you need to contact your local congressional representative, I would say at least 3 or 4 weeks in advance. Sometimes they can sneak you in a little later, but they're always happy to talk to people from back home, and they're always excited that you're coming to DC to visit. Number 5 is the National Archives. So a lot of people might think this is kind of boring or something, but to me, this is quite amazing. So the National Archives are where the Charters of Freedom are on display. The Charters of Freedom are the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And the actual original documents are on display in the National Archives there. Now they have museums and they have a lot more there than just those three things, but those are the highlights. And you have to get a ticket to go see them, at least right now you do. I'm not sure if that's always the case, but you get to walk in there and look at these three documents and learn a little bit about them. You can't take any pictures of them, obviously. They don't want flash photography or anything like that, and they're not going to let you take any other photography either. The documents are a little faded, but I think it's just quite amazing to look at these original documents that the founders wrote out and signed. Number 4 is Ford's Theater. This is where Abraham Lincoln was shot. Now, one thing I really like about this is the fact that in Washington, D.C., most of the sites are dedicated to people who made history. But at Ford's Theater, this is where history actually occurred. So Abraham Lincoln attended a play here, and John Wilkes Booth entered the theater while the play was going on, and he went up behind Lincoln and shot him in the head with his pistol. He jumped onto the stage and shouted something and then ran off into the woods, and it took him a few weeks to track him down, and they finally killed him. But Lincoln was then taken across the street to a place called the Peterson House, and that's where he died. It was in the Peterson House. The theater was not used for many years out of reverence to President Lincoln. They didn't think it would be appropriate to show plays there anymore, and so it kind of shut down and it went into disrepair. But it has now been remodeled and restored, and it is actually a functioning theater. They do plays in Ford's Theater. It would be really cool to watch a play in the theater. It's a beautiful theater. But if you're looking for a tour, you just have to book a time online ahead of time, during a time when they're not doing a play, and the ranger will tell you some really fascinating stories. I mean, he's just a great guy to listen to. It's one of the highlights of our trip when we go there is listening to this guy tell the story of the night that Lincoln was assassinated. For my money, this is a must that you have to do when you visit Washington, D.C. Okay, number 3 is Mount Vernon. This is George Washington's home. Now, this is about 30 minutes away from Washington, D.C., so you do need to get there somehow. Usually, you're going to need to rent a car to drive down there. Uber is pretty expensive if you do that, I think. So, Mount Vernon is George Washington's home. This is located along the Potomac River. It's a huge estate. Just got a lot of greenery and open grass area and gardens, and it's just really beautiful. Here you can do a tour of his home, which was called Mount Vernon, and you can see the bedroom that he died in. And then you can also walk around the grounds a bit. And what they have there is slave quarters, they have livestock, they have gardens, and then they also have his actual tomb. So he and Martha, George Washington and Martha Washington, are entombed there on site, and it's kind of a cool little spot there that's guarded by these colonial era soldiers. And then you can just hang out back and look at the river. When I was there, they had kind of a little farmer's market going on. It's just kind of like a trip back in time to colonial America. Okay, number 2 is the Lincoln Memorial. So this is kind of the famous image of Washington, D.C. for so many people. It's appeared in movies like Forrest Gump. It's where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. This is a huge monument dedicated to Abraham Lincoln and his legacy. It looks like this Greek temple with all these pillars surrounding it, and Lincoln sits there inside his temple overlooking the pond and the Washington Monument. This is much bigger than you realize. Every time we go there, it's like, oh wow, I just had forgotten how big it is. You stand there at his feet, gazing up at Lincoln, and it's kind of a reverent place. You need to be quiet when you're there. And on either end of the building, they have his famous speeches. So on one end is the Gettysburg Address. On the other end is the second inaugural address, which is much less known than the Gettysburg Address, but every bit as impressive. Number 1 is the Washington Monument. This is the tallest structure in Washington, D.C. It is a big stone obelisk that is over 550 feet tall. I just love visiting the Washington Monument. Again, it's much bigger than you realize. You have to get right up close to it to kind of appreciate it. Now, the nice and cool thing that you have to do with the Washington Monument is to go to the top. So you can get a ticket online ahead of time to get a ride to the very top of the monument, and then you can look out from all 4 windows and see the city and the National Mall there in all its glory. The monument is not held together by steel or mortar. It is just stone upon stone held together by gravity. Sounds a little terrifying, but it's actually not that bad. Okay, now for a few honorable mentions that I didn't bring up, but other people really enjoy when they go to Washington, D.C. So you'll notice I didn't mention the White House, and that's because for the most part, the White House is just kind of a quick photo op. You can book a tour of the White House though, so you have to do that more in advance than you do the Capitol. They have more security measures there at the White House. My understanding is the tour isn't all that great. It's not as nice as the Capitol from what I've heard. I've tried multiple times, but I keep getting shut out for various reasons and just haven't been able to do a tour of the White House. Other popular things, the National Zoo, which is a free zoo. They have the Holocaust Museum. The Holocaust Museum is not free. I've been to Holocaust museums in DC, New York, and Jerusalem, and I tell you, I'm done going to Holocaust museums. They're a really depressing experience, but I know that's kind of a top thing for a lot of people. Other museums include the International Spy Museum, the Postal Museum, which sounds boring, but I have heard it's great. The Mint. The Library of Congress is a beautiful building. We visited this the first time we went there, my wife and I, and it really is a beautiful building. Just a great place to visit. Just doesn't make the top 10. The Supreme Court as well is a place to visit, but doesn't make the top 10. There's so many museums around the town. One that I just saw recently is called the National Building Museum. I didn't actually visit it. I just saw it online, but a museum for architecture. What an interesting idea. Other people like visiting the Pentagon or Georgetown, the neighborhood of Georgetown, or driving down to Old Town Alexandria, Virginia. These are all things that are really popular for a lot of people, but they don't make my top 10. Make sure to check out my playlist for more videos about Washington, D.C. to get you prepared and excited for your trip. Thank you so much, and we'll see you later.